I was dead. At least, that's how it felt in that silent void where there was no pain, no light, nothing but a strange peace I'd never known. And it was there, in that indescribable place, that I heard a voice that would change everything. "You're not alone, Edward. I've been here all along." At that moment, I, who had spent years mocking religion, writing articles against faith, and ridiculing anyone who believed in God, was face to face with something my rational mind couldn't explain. Let me tell you how I got to this point, because this story didn't begin on that rainy September night. It began much earlier, in my childhood, in a house where the Bible was read every day and the name of Jesus was spoken with reverence. My father was the pastor of a small Baptist church, and my mother, a Sunday school teacher. I grew up singing hymns, attending services, and memorizing Bible verses. To any outsider, I was the perfect son of an exemplary Christian family, but inside, something was wrong. From a very young age, I felt like I was watching a play. People sang, prayed, cried, but to me it all seemed artificial, forced. I looked around during services and saw faces that seemed genuine, but I felt nothing, absolutely nothing. It was as if there was a wall of glass between me and the experience everyone else seemed to share. When I was 12, something happened that planted the first seed of my rebellion. The church deacon, a man respected by all, was caught embezzling funds. The scandal spread like wildfire, and I saw my father crying in his study, trying to explain to the congregation what had happened. I saw my mother comforting families who had entrusted their offerings for the new church building. And I saw hypocrisy revealed in a cruel and definitive way. That night, when my mother came to say good night and began to pray for me as she always did, I interrupted her for the first time in my life. "Mom, if God exists, why did he let this happen?" She was silent for a long time, just stroking my hair. Finally she whispered, "Son, sometimes people fail, but God doesn't." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel the same certainty I saw in her eyes, but all I felt was a growing anger toward a God who allowed good people like my parents to suffer because of hypocrites. During adolescence, my rebellion intensified. I began to question everything, the biblical stories that seemed too fantastical to be true, the doctrines that didn't make sense to my logical mind, the very existence of a God who allowed so much suffering in the world. My father tried to talk to me, to show me verses, to explain theology, but I had closed my heart. Every attempt only irritated me more. When I turned 17, I made a decision that would deeply hurt my parents. I stopped going to church. At first, they tried to convince me, to plead with me, even to threaten me. But I was determined. I told them I no longer believed in any of it, that I considered religion a crutch for weak people who couldn't face the reality of life. The words came out of my mouth like daggers, and I saw tears in my mother's eyes, but I was blinded by my own arrogance. In college, I found an environment that fueled my rebellion. I studied philosophy and sociology, surrounding myself with professors and colleagues who shared my skeptical worldview. I read Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, all the great critics of religion. Each book I devoured gave me more ammunition for my arguments against faith. I started writing articles for student newspapers, then for blogs, always attacking what I considered religious ignorance. My specialty was dismantling biblical arguments. I spent hours studying apparent contradictions in the scriptures, analyzing the historical context to show how the Bible was merely a product of its time, irrelevant to the modern world. I participated in public debates, always positioning myself as the defender of reason against superstition. My favorite phrase, which I repeated whenever I could, was "The Bible is a book full of contradictions and fables, used to manipulate the weak." I believed this with every fiber of my being. More than that, I prided myself on my intellectual clarity, on my ability to see through the illusions that blinded so many people. When I encountered Christians in debates or online discussions, I destroyed them with logical arguments, scientific citations, and historical analyses. I felt like a liberator, someone who was helping humanity break free from ancestral shackles, but beneath all that intellectual arrogance, there was something I didn't want to admit, a deep pain. The pain of having grown up expecting to feel something I never did, of having longed for the simple faith of my parents, but not being able to attain it. The pain of seeing the suffering of good people and finding no explanation, the pain of feeling alone in a universe that seemed cold and purposeless. I built my entire identity around this rebellion. I became a university professor, specializing in the sociology of religion. My focus was on analyzing how religious beliefs arose and persisted in societies, always from a purely materialistic perspective. I wrote books, gave lectures, and became a leading figure in academia as one of the country's foremost critics of organized religion. My parents, who had grown old watching my progressive estrangement, never stopped praying for me. I know this because my mother told me later. For years, she got up at dawn to intercede for my soul. My father, even wounded by my harsh words, never stopped loving me. When we met on special occasions, he looked at me with deep sadness, but also with a hope I didn't understand. "Son," he'd sometimes say, "I know you're hurting, but God doesn't give up on you." I'd roll my eyes, dismissing it as another desperate attempt to reconvert me. How wrong I was. It was against this backdrop of seemingly triumphant rebellion that September night arrived. I had given a lecture at a university on the role of religion in maintaining social inequality. The auditorium was packed, the debate was heated, and I left feeling victorious once more. I had managed to plant seeds of doubt in several young minds. I had exposed the contradictions of the Christian faith. I had once again fulfilled my role as an intellectual liberator. The rain started coming down hard as I left the university. I drove my car down the state highway, listening to classical music on the radio, and planning my next article. The topic would be psychological manipulation in biblical texts. I already had several arguments in my head, several quotes I would use to demonstrate how the Bible was a tool of social control. That's when I saw the headlights of the truck. It all happened very fast and very slowly at the same time. I saw the heavy vehicle skid on the wet road, lose control, and cross the center line directly in my direction. I had time to think. So this is how it ends. Meaningless, purposeless, just a random accident in an indifferent universe. I slammed on the brakes, tried to swerve, but it was too late. The impact was devastating. My car was thrown off the road, rolled 3 times, and came to a stop on an embankment. I was trapped in the wreckage, feeling life draining away. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The pain was unbearable at first, but then it subsided, replaced by a strange feeling of disconnection. And then, everything went dark. But it wasn't a frightening darkness. It was a comforting darkness, like a silent embrace. There was no pain there, no fear, no weight of earthly concerns. There was only a profound peace, unlike anything I had ever experienced. For a moment, I thought I had died, and that death was simply this, nothing, which would fit perfectly with my materialistic worldview. Then I heard the voice. It wasn't an audible voice, not in the common sense. It was more like a thought that wasn't mine, a communication that bypassed my ears entirely and went straight to the center of my being. Clear, firm, yet incredibly loving. "You are not alone, Edward. I have been here all along." My first reaction was typical of someone who had spent decades fighting anything supernatural. This is delirium. My brain is dying and creating hallucinations to comfort me. It's basic neuroscience. But even as I thought this, a part of me knew that this was different. It was more real than anything I had ever experienced. The voice continued, patiently, "You rejected who I am because of the pain caused by men. But you never truly knew me." Images began to appear in my mind. They weren't ordinary memories, but recollections seen from a different perspective, as if someone were showing me scenes from my life through other eyes. I saw my mother, still young, kneeling beside my bed while I slept, praying silently with tears in her eyes. I saw my father in the church office, not preaching or doing theology, but simply weeping and asking God why it was so difficult to reach the heart of his own son. I also saw moments I had completely forgotten. At 6 years old, alone in the backyard, looking at the starry sky, and feeling a strange sensation that someone was watching me with love. At 10 years old, listening to a hymn in church and wanting to cry without knowing why. At 15, going through a difficult time at school, and whispering a quick prayer, almost without realizing it, before scolding myself for it. Each image was accompanied by a feeling of loving presence, as if someone had been there in all those moments, patiently waiting for me to notice him, but respecting my choice not to. You built your entire identity around your pain, the voice said gently. Your anger wasn't against me, it was against the idea that I could exist and still allow you to suffer. But son, your suffering was never invisible to me. At that moment, I understood. All my rebellion, all my intellectual arrogance, all my crusade against religion, all of it was armor I had built to protect a wounded child who had desperately wanted to feel God's presence but had failed. Instead of admitting the pain of that absence, I had chosen to deny the very existence of what I desired. The tears came then, not physical tears, because I didn't have a body in that place, but tears of the soul, tears of repentance, of shame, of a pain I had carried for decades without even admitting it existed. If you still have a choice, the voice said, now more distant, you will live, and if you live, it will be for a reason. The comforting darkness began to dissipate, and I felt myself being pulled back. I fought against it, wanting to stay in that presence, in that peace, but an inescapable force brought me back. When I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. My body ached all over, but I was alive. A young doctor explained to me that I had been in a very serious accident, that paramedics found me unconscious but stable, and that it was a miracle I had survived with relatively minor injuries. By the physics of the impact, he said, shaking his head, you should be dead, or at least paraplegic. I can't explain how you came out of this practically unscathed. In the days following, while recovering in the hospital, I had too much time to think. I tried to rationalize what had happened. It was a typical near-death experience, I told myself. My oxygen-deprived brain created hallucinations based on my religious upbringing, but no matter how hard I tried to fit the experience into known scientific molds, something didn't fit. There was a peace within me I had never felt before. A quiet certainty that regardless of what my rational mind said, I had encountered something or someone real. It was as if a thirst I didn't even know I had been quenched. It was on the third night in the hospital that I found the note. It was on the nightstand beside my bed, written in simple script, God has plans for you. He doesn't give up on those he loves. It was signed only Josiah, paramedic. That note made me cry. Not from pain or despair, but from an emotion I couldn't name. It was as if those simple words were the physical confirmation of something I had experienced in that comforting void. When I was discharged, the first thing I did was look for a Bible, not to critique or analyze, but to read. Simply read. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was as if I were approaching something sacred for the first time in my adult life. The page that opened was Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The words hit me like lightning. I had read that verse hundreds of times in my academic career, always analytically, critically. But now, it spoke directly to me. While we were still sinners, even while I rejected him, even while I blasphemed him, even while I built my entire life fighting him, he had died for me. Not for who I could become, but for who I was in that exact moment. And then, something inside me broke completely. I fell to my knees right there in my living room, and for the first time in over 20 years, I prayed. It wasn't an eloquent or theologically correct prayer. It was just a deep groan from the soul. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Forgive me. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or magical. In the following months, I had to rebuild my entire worldview. I had to admit to myself that I had been wrong about many things. I had to deal with the shame of having hurt so many people with my arrogance. I had to relearn how to relate to my parents, who never stopped loving me despite everything. But I also discovered a joy I had never known, the joy of not having to have all the answers, of being able to simply trust, the joy of knowing that I wasn't alone in the universe, that there was a greater purpose even for the things I didn't understand, the joy of forgiving, and of being forgiven. My academic colleagues were shocked when I announced my conversion. Some tried to convince me that I was experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. Others simply rejected me. I lost some jobs, some friendships, some speaking engagements, but I gained something infinitely more valuable, inner peace. And here I want to pause to speak directly to you who are listening to this story. If you've been going through moments of doubt, if you've struggled with questions of faith, if you've felt that God is distant or even non-existent, I understand that pain. I lived in it for decades. But I can tell you that sometimes our own pain blinds us to a presence that has always been there, patiently waiting for us. If this story has touched your heart in any way, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel to continue following testimonies like this, stories of real people who have found hope even in the most difficult times. Today, 10 years after that accident, my life is completely different. I'm no longer a university professor. I left academia to dedicate myself to something I never imagined I would do, sharing my story. I travel the country speaking at schools, universities, youth groups, even atheist and agnostic groups like I used to be. I'm not going to lie to you. I still have doubts sometimes. I still question. I still struggle with difficult questions about suffering, about injustice, about the mysteries of faith. The difference is that now, I ask these questions not from a place of rebellion, but from a place of relationship, like a son who can question his father, because he knows he is loved. I reconciled with my parents, and I had the privilege of spending the last years of their lives learning from their wisdom. My father died 3 years ago, and his last words to me were, "Son, God never gave up on you." My mother, now 82, still prays for me every day, but now they are prayers of gratitude instead of desperate pleas. I married a wonderful woman who helps me grow in faith every day. We have 2 children, and I'm learning to be the kind of father they need, present, loving, but also honest about my own struggles and weaknesses. My ministry, if I can call it that, is unconventional. I don't wear a suit. I don't preach in traditional pulpits. I don't carry a giant Bible under my arm. My main tool is my own story, my own testimony of how God can reach even the hardest heart. When I speak to groups of skeptics, I don't try to win theological debates. I don't present complex philosophical arguments for the existence of God. I simply tell what happened to me. I talk about the pain that was under my rebellion, the presence I found at the most desperate moment of my life, the transformation that is still happening in me day after day. What strikes me most, people respond not to my arguments, but to the authenticity of the experience. I've seen staunch atheists weep when I tell about that voice in the void. I've seen hardened agnostics question their own certainties, not because I intellectually convinced them, but because something in the story resonates with a spiritual hunger they didn't even know they had. Sometimes people ask if I regret those years of rebellion, if I regret wasting so much time fighting God, and my answer is always no, because now I understand that even those years were part of the story God was writing in my life. My experience as a skeptic gave me a language to speak with other skeptics. My pain gave me empathy to understand the pain of others. My own journey away from God allows me to walk alongside others on their journey back to Him. I discovered that God doesn't fear our tough questions. He doesn't feel threatened by our honest doubts. What he wants isn't our blind submission, but our open hearts. He can work with sincere doubts far better than with false faith. One of the most beautiful things I've learned is that God speaks the language we need to hear. To me, who lived in the world of abstract ideas, he spoke through an experience that transcended the rational but still made sense to who I was. To my mother, who was always a simple and devout woman, he speaks through silent prayers and small everyday miracles. To my father, who was a man of study, he spoke through scripture and theology. That paramedic's note, from Josiah, became a powerful symbol for me. I never managed to find him to thank him personally, but his simple words were the first tangible sign that my experience had been real. Sometimes, God uses ordinary people to deliver extraordinary messages. Josiah probably has no idea the impact that note had on my life. I keep the note with me to this day. When I face difficult times, when doubts whisper in my ear, when I wonder if I imagined it all, I reread those words. God has plans for you. He doesn't give up on those he loves. Today, I understand that my story isn't about me. It's about a God who pursues those he loves, even when they're running in the opposite direction. It's about a love that doesn't give up, that doesn't tire, that finds creative ways to reach hearts that seem impossible to touch. If you're listening to this story, and identifying with the Edward of before, the skeptic, the rebel, the one who builds intellectual walls to protect a wounded heart, I want you to know, you are not beyond the reach of God's love. No matter how far you've run, no matter how many terrible things you've said about him, no matter how hardened your heart seems to be, God has plans for you, and he doesn't give up on those he loves. Sometimes I'm asked what the biggest lesson I've learned from all this is, and my answer is always the same, that the opposite of faith isn't doubt, it's indifference. I was never indifferent to God. Even when I rejected him, even when I fought him, I was deeply engaged with the question of his existence. And God can work with passion, even when it's directed against him. My experience in that silent void after the accident taught me that death isn't the end, that there's something beyond this material life we know, but more than that, it taught me that this something beyond isn't an impersonal cosmic force or an abstract philosophical concept. It's personal, it's loving, it's relational, it's someone who knows me by name, and who never stopped loving me, even when I despised him. In recent years, I've had the privilege of walking alongside other people on their own faith journeys. Some are ex-atheists like I was. Others are people who always believed but lost their faith's flame amid life's difficulties. Still others are young people who grew up in church but never had a personal encounter with God. What I've learned is that each story is unique, but there's a common thread. God meets each of us exactly where we are. He doesn't expect us to clean ourselves up first, to have all the right answers, or to be worthy of his love. He meets us in our mess, in our confusion, in our pain, and that's where he begins to work. For me, that work continues every day. I'm still learning to trust when I don't understand. I'm still learning to love as he loves. I'm still discovering the plans he has for my life. But now I do all this not alone, but in the company of the one who never gave up on me. If this story has touched your heart in any way, I want to encourage you to take a step toward faith. It doesn't have to be a big step, it could be just a simple prayer. God, if you exist, reveal yourself to me. It could be picking up a Bible and reading a verse with an open heart. It could be talking to someone you know has genuine faith. The important thing is to begin, because God is waiting on the other side of that decision, just as he was waiting on the other side of my rebellion all those years ago. He has plans for you, plans to prosper you, and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future, and he never ever gives up on those he loves. Thank you for listening to my story. May God bless you on your own journey, wherever it may lead you.